coming to the next question, a pregnant woman undergoes routine prenatal screening and a healthcare provider explains the process of passive immunity transfer to the fetus. How is IgG transported across the placenta to provide immunity to the fetus? See, it is transferred through active transport by Fc receptors on the syncytiotrophoblasts cells. Now, one thing you should remember that you have questions related to immunology. So, which is the largest immunoglobulin? There's some questions you may have. The largest immunoglobulin is IgM. Which is the immunoglobulin which is able to pass through the placenta? That is IgG. Yes, correct. Which is the immunoglobulin which is associated with, which is produced in the breast milk? Yes, IgA. Which immunoglobulin is the first? Yes, IgA. Which is the first immunoglobulin which is produced? The primary response is through which immunoglobulin? Yes, the primary response is through IgM. IgM is the first immunoglobulin which is produced, and the secondary response later is IgG. So you should remember this because it could be as one of the potential questions. They will surely ask you something about the immunoglobulin in some form or the other. It could also be that somebody had exposure to chickenpox and her screen was done and that showed IgG. So what does that indicate? Or if the screen indicates IgM, so what does that indicate? So you must so coming to the next question, a 28-year-old woman presents the history of secondary infertility. She and her partner have been trying to conceive for past 18 months without success. Her menstrual cycles are regular, occurring every 28 to 30. This is probably she reports no previous pregnancy loss. On pelvic examination, there are no abnormalities noted. A transvaginal ultrasound is performed, revealing normal uterine morphology with patent fallopian tubes. No ovarian abnormality are detected. Which of the following is the most appropriate next step in the management? Yes, again, this is a very simple question. This is something what all of you are doing day in and out. A patient with infertility comes to the OPD, the first thing you do is semen analysis for the male partner. So, but they have given a huge clinical scenario just to kind of confuse you. So coming to the next question, in the emergency department, a pregnant woman aged 45 presents with a forearm laceration from machinery work. Despite active bleeding initially, the bleeding ceases after pressure is applied and the wound is cleaned and dressed. Considering her pregnancy, what specific consideration should be taken into account for the healing process of her wound? So what happens to the immunity during a pregnancy? So, and how could it affect the wound healing? Yes, there is an altered immune response, and that may result in an increased risk of infection. So, a 24-year-old woman is hospitalized to the emergency room with chronic pregnancy-related hyperemesis. She is currently feeling quite ill and seems dehydrated. Her blood pressure is 110 by 60 millimeters. Her heart rate is 100. Her SpO2 level is 98% on room air and her respiratory rate 20 breaths per minute. What is the most likely acid-base problem in this patient? Okay, this you are correct. This is metabolic alkalosis because of hyperemesis. She has lost a lot of her gastric contents, which are acidic in nature, and as a result, she's developed metabolic alkalosis. So the answer is metabolic alkalosis. Now, suppose the respiratory rate would have been 15 instead of 20, then what would have been the answer? Can somebody tell me? Because I made the respiratory rate as 20, and so the answer is metabolic alkalosis. Now, if the respiratory rate would have been 15, that means she is hypoventilating. the normal respiratory rate would vary somewhere between, say, 15 to 18 breaths per minute. Okay. And if the respiratory rate is on the lower side, what does it indicate? It indicates that simultaneously something else is also happening, because if she is having metabolic alkalosis, the compensatory mechanism is that the patient starts hypoventilating so that she can retain more carbon dioxide. If more carbon dioxide is retained, it will help in formation of the carbonic acid, which will form H plus ions and the bicarbonate, the H plus ions, right? So that to compensate the alkalosis. So in that case, there would be a compensatory respiratory acidosis. So here, till now, the respiratory acidosis, the compensatory acidosis has not begun to occur. Okay, so now you understand, if the question, if they change the respiratory rate a little, the answer will change. So make sure you read the question very, very carefully. Next question, a 32-year-old pregnant woman presents at 20 weeks of gestation for her routine antenatal appointment. She has a history of type 1 diabetes mellitus, which is well controlled with insulin therapy. Her pre-pregnancy glycosylated hemoglobin level was 6.5%. During consultation, she is asked about the risk of fetal anomalies associated with diabetes. So what is the most appropriate response? In a patient with gestational diabetes or a history of type 1 diabetes, how much should be the glycosylated hemoglobin? What is the limit? It should be less than 6.5% glycosylated hemoglobin or less than 48 millimoles per mole. This is as per the NICE guidelines. Okay. And if it is more, then she obviously will be associated with a high risk of fetal anomalies. And so you need to offer her a detailed anomaly scan at 22 to 22 weeks. Okay. So a 28-year-old pregnant woman, Gravida 1, Para 0, presents to the antenatal clinic for her booking appointment at 10 weeks gestation. She has a history of endometriosis and is concerned about the impact of her condition on her pregnancy. What is the most appropriate advice regarding endometriosis and pregnancy? So how does endometriosis affect pregnancy? Endometriosis results in an increased risk of miscarriage and preterm birth. And so you have to closely monitor such patients during their pregnancy. A 32-year-old pregnant woman with a history of chronic hypertension presents to the antenatal clinic for a routine checkup at 12 weeks gestation. She is currently taking enalapril for blood pressure control. What is the most appropriate action regarding her medication management during pregnancy? So also teratogenesis is very, very important from point of view of MRCOG part 1. So make sure you remember what all side effects or what all teratogenic effects can be caused by various drugs. Again, you know, enalapril should never be administered to pregnant women because of what reason? It can result in renal dysfunction. And so if she was already taking, you have to switch it over. Switch it with what? Probably nifedipine. In this case, the calcium channel blocker is the best option which you can give in this case. Okay. Yes, renal agenesis and sometimes even fetal death can be caused by ACE inhibitors, enalapril. So a 35-year-old pregnant woman, Gravida 2 Para 1, presents to the antenatal clinic for a routine checkup at 12 weeks gestation. She has a history of celiac disease diagnosed 5 years ago. She's concerned about the potential impact of her condition on her pregnancy. What is the most appropriate advice regarding celiac disease and pregnancy? So how can celiac disease affect pregnancy? So I'm going to the previous question because some candidate has a doubt. Should we not of course, we should start her on nifedipine, Dr. Shweta. The question says that she was already taking enalapril. Probably she was being administered enalapril from her preconceptional period. Before conception also probably she was on enalapril. So now she is pregnant, you need to switch over to nifedipine. This is what the question is about. Okay, so most of you are answering option C, which is the correct option because it's a celiac disease. This is resulting in malabsorption because there is a immune reaction which is taking place at the level of intestine. The anti-gluten antibodies are formed and that results in causing malabsorption in celiac disease. And so you have to be careful for some nutritional deficiencies which might creep in. She might not be able to absorb iron properly. She might not be able to absorb vitamin B12 properly. So you need to screen her for all her nutritional deficiencies. In clinical case involving a 28-year-old newly diagnosed HIV positive female patient, the healthcare provider observes a declining trend in the patient's CD4 count during routine follow-up appointments. The patient has been asymptomatic but is concerned about the progression of her HIV infection. At what point should the healthcare provider consider initiating pneumocystis carinii prophylaxis for this patient? Again, HIV in pregnancy, an important topic. And this is a very obvious that the CD4 count should be less than 200 cells per millimeter cube because in that case, the chances of opportunistic infections, it highly increases. And so in those cases, you should start the prophylaxis against pneumocystis carinii. What is the primary etiology of hemolytic anemia in newborns known as Rh hemolytic disease, which occurs due to an immunological response between mother and fetus? Again, a very easy question. What do you think happens? Yes, it is an Rh incompatibility between the maternal and the fetal blood types. Because probably the mother is Rh negative, but the father, if the father is also Rh negative, there is no issue. But if the father is Rh positive, and mother is Rh negative, there could be chances that the baby who is conceived is Rh positive. And in that case, there's an incompatibility between the Rh negative mother and the Rh positive fetus. Because the fetal red cells, they get transferred into the maternal bloodstream. They may result in formation of antibodies, which may again travel through the placenta and attack the fetal cells, resulting in hemolytic anemia. So what is the perinatal mortality? What does it mean? So perinatal mortality refers to the perinatal deaths. And how do you calculate the perinatal deaths? The deaths which are occurring after 22 weeks of gestation. This is as per the WHO definition. Okay. Perinatal death is after 22 weeks of gestation and 7 days in the postnatal period. However, if we go by the UK definition, it was initially the perinatal death was the death which was occurring after 28 weeks. Now they have made it to 24 weeks. So deaths which are occurring after 24 weeks of gestation until 7 days postpartum. So perinatal mortality again becomes an important question which can come in your part 1 exam. So a 35-year-old woman presents with a history of recurrent pregnancy loss. She experienced 3 consecutive first trimester miscarriages in the past 2 years. Investigations, including karyotyping and thrombophilia screening, have been unremarkable. However, a detailed examination of the products of conception using scanning electron microscopy reveals abnormal morphology of chorionic villi. So if there is an abnormal morphology of chorionic villi, what are we talking about? H-mole, molar pregnancy. And now we need to differentiate between the complete mole and the partial mole. So it is characterized by irregular branched villus structure with decreased branching complexity. So wherever you have an irregular structure, because if it is complete mole, there will be a homogeneous hydropic degeneration of the chorionic villi. And if it is an irregular degeneration, there are focal areas where there is degeneration and rest of the villi is normal, and there are also fetal tissue which is present, then that is a partial mole. Again, partial mole, complete mole becomes very, very important for MRCOG part 1. Which of the conditions is passed down through mitochondrial inheritance? You surely will have few questions pertaining to genetic inheritance. No, I agree. There's a question by Dr. Saida. Fetal tissue is not mentioned. That's fine, but they have mentioned about the irregular villi. No, they may not mention everything. But if it is an irregular villi, that means they would have mentioned it is regular, or irregular means it is focal changes which are occurring. If there are focal changes, that means it is a partial mole. Okay. So yes, most of you have answered option E. It is Leber's optic neuropathy. Please remember the inheritance of common disorders, because they will ask what is the inheritance of Marfan syndrome, of sickle cell. If you go through my book, there is a chapter on genetics and that details the tables. Make sure you remember those. Okay. So a 35-year-old pregnant woman presents for genetic counseling due to advanced maternal age. She is concerned about the risk of chromosomal abnormalities in her unborn child. Which of the following prenatal screening tests is most appropriate for assessing the risk of chromosomal abnormalities in this patient? She's not even conceived. NIPT or the CFF DNA, cell-free fetal DNA. Make sure you know about this, because there could be a question, there could be even an image-based question pertaining to this. There could be a question where there could be an image-based question where they may show the procedure of how the fetal DNA cells they pass on to the mother, because that is what is detected in this investigation. A public health initiative. She's not pregnant, she's planning a conception, I think. No, she is pregnant. She's pregnant. She's concerned about the risk of abnormalities in her unborn child. Probably this was non-pregnant. This is a 35-year-old woman who is just planning her pregnancy. Okay, sorry about that. So now coming to the next question, a public health initiative is implemented in a community to reduce the incidence of preterm birth. The initiative includes educational programs, access to prenatal care, and community support for pregnant women. After 1 year of implementation, data analysis shows a significant decrease in the rate of preterm birth in the community compared to the previous year. Which of the following study designs is most likely used to evaluate the effectiveness of public health initiative? So a study, yes, you're right. Dr. Mandeep, you are right. CFF DNA comes only in pregnancy. So that is the correct question. But they haven't mentioned the period of gestation. They have just mentioned that she's come early in pregnancy. So this is the time when we can do this NIPT. Question. Uh, which of the study designs for evaluating the effectiveness of public health initiative? So wherever you are trying to study a initiative or the effectiveness of an educational program with respect to a community, and it is not just a group or a group of cases or a group of control population. In that case, it will always be an ecological study. So just remember that. So in labor and delivery ward, a 30-year-old pregnant woman presents with signs of acute hemolysis shortly after receiving a blood transfusion due to postpartum hemorrhage. The medical team suspects an adverse reaction and investigates the underlying cause. In the context of blood transfusion reactions in obstetrics, What is the primary mechanism responsible for acute hemolytic reactions following the administration of incompatible blood and blood products? So, what is the most common thing which can occur because of the administration of incompatible blood products? The most important thing, she is having an acute hemolytic reaction. So, what do you think has precipitated this? There's incompatible blood, so this becomes ABO incompatibility, no? Sorry, my pen is not working, so you will be unable to see the stop for some reason. So coming to the next question, after vaginal hysterectomy and repair, a patient exhibits a urine output of 300 ml over 24 hours. What could be the potential cause of this observation? So what is the normal urine output which you expect over 24 hours? About 1 to 2 liters, right? And here it is about 300 ml over 24 hours. So, and she has recently undergone a vaginal hysterectomy and repair. Yes, you're correct. 30 to 40 ml per hour is what is normally. So in one day, about 1 to 2 liters is what you expect. So yes, the answer is that she probably has urinary retention due to bladder atony. If this continues, then you have to look for if there's any underlying complication. But this is, she has just undergone and over 24 hours. If this would have been over a longer period of time, then you also need to investigate for any other complication which has occurred during, for example, some damage to the ureter or some other thing which has occurred. A 28-year-old woman presents with primary amenorrhea and lack of breast development. On examination, she has short stature, webbed neck, and widely spaced nipples. Hormonal investigations revealed elevated follicle stimulating hormone and LH levels with low estradiol levels. So, what is the most likely diagnosis? So, what is the thing which is happening in this case? This is a very what is the diagnosis? Yes, it is Turner's. What is happening in this case? It is dysgenetic gonads or streak ovaries, and this is a very typical presentation of Turner's syndrome. So, which process leads to, yes, correct, Dr. Hina, it is hypergonadotropic hypogonadism. It is, but that is not in the option. So, again, you have to be careful regarding what the options say. So, which process leads to the formation of three primary germ layers, each contributing to the development of specific tissues and organs in a fetus? Yes, gastrulation. So what should be the, yes, option C, again, very easy. During cesarean section, the obstetrician makes an incision through the abdominal wall and uterus to access the fetus. Which of the following uterine incisions is most commonly used for cesarean deliveries due to its ease of access and reduced risk of uterine rupture in subsequent pregnancies? Again, a very easy question. Yes, transverse horizontal incision. They also have this tendency of giving you very easy questions so that you get, you may question yourself. It cannot be so simple. So it's okay. They will have some very simple, very easy questions also. A 27-year-old woman pregnant for the first time visits with mild abdominal discomfort and vaginal spotting with her last menstrual period occurring 5 weeks ago. Initial beta HCG levels measure 258 international units per liter. As she shows no signs of instability or risk factors for ectopic pregnancy, she is discharged and instructed to return in 2 days for a repeat beta HCG. Subsequent results shows day 1 is 258 IU per liter. So day 1 is 258 IU per liter and day 3 is 460 IU per liter. So what is the best which describes the pattern which is observed in this case? How much should be the rise over 48 hours? it should be at least 66%, okay, which is occurring in this case. So it is a normal rise, but you cannot still exclude ectopic pregnancy, okay? Because a rise of 66% is what, and with of what should actually occur every 48 hours. And at a beta HCG level of about 1500 international units per liter, you should be able to see the intrauterine sac. So Dr. Pallavi is saying it is with difficult ones where it decides we can clear or not. Don't worry about the difficult questions. There will be some questions you will have no idea about, and which is a very normal thing, and that will not prevent you from passing your part one. So don't get tense. There'll be some questions you'll have absolutely no idea about it, and it's absolutely normal. Okay. So what method is commonly used to calculate probability? Yes, the multiplication principle. Because the multiplication principle is used to calculate the probability of two or more independent events which are occurring together, and it involves 32. This is the answer. Normal rise you cannot, because it is a rise of more than 66%, which is occurring over 48 hours. So it is a normal rise, but still in this case, you cannot exclude out ectopic pregnancy. Okay, there was a question which, so for calculation of hazard ratio, you can refer to the course manual, you can refer to my book, because unfortunately, this is not a session on statistics. If we don't discuss the questions, we'll not be able to finish it. So what percentage of cardiac output typically flows to the kidneys in non-pregnant state? It is 20 to 25% of cardiac output which flows to the kidney. And this is, you can imagine that 1/4 of your output is going to kidneys because so much is happening in the kidneys. Okay, there is a high metabolic demand which occurs in the kidneys because kidneys are responsible for filtering out blood, maintaining your electrolyte balance, and for regulating your fluid hemostasis. So in a genitourinary clinic, a 33-year-old woman with known HIV is examined. She hasn't started taking antiretroviral medication yet. She reports increased vaginal discharge, bilateral pelvic discomfort, and profound dyspareunia. She's apyrexia and otherwise in good health. Inflammatory indicators in serum are typical. Her presumed pelvic inflammatory illness is being treated. Which course of action is most appropriate? So obviously she is an HIV patient and she is diagnosed with PID. So what happens when you have PID with underlying HIV infection? It's just that the infection can be a little more aggressive if you have an underlying HIV infection, but the course of treatment remains the same. So in this case, you have to give standard 2 weeks of antibiotic treatment. A 35-year-old woman presents with pelvic pain and pressure. On examination, her uterus is enlarged and multiple irregular masses are palpable. What is the most likely type of uterine fibroid present in this case? Yes, a subserosal fibroid. I would say subserosal. There was some controversy in this question that it is submucosal. But because if it would have been submucosal, she would have HMB, which she doesn't have in this case. It's just pelvic pain and pressure. So I would answer it as a subserosal fibroid. A 28-year-old woman presents with primary infertility. She has never been pregnant. On examination, her uterus appears normal, but she has absent fallopian tubes. Which embryological anomaly is associated with absence of fallopian tubes? So paramesonephric ducts normally they fuse and they result in the formation of uterus, and the lateral end of these paramesonephric ducts, it results in formation of fallopian tubes. So if there is a defect in the lateral part of the paramesonephric ducts. That is what is going to result in absent fallopian tubes. So obviously the answer is option B in this case. A 32-year-old married woman visited regarding consultation as she wants to conceive. On examination, she is observed with fatigue and pallor. Lab test shows microcytic hypochromic anemia. Which screening method is applied here? So, if she is having microcytic hypochromic anemia, what does it refer to? Probably she has iron deficiency anemia. So, what kind of screening method should you do in this case? Screening, how do you screen such women? Her iron stores, her ferritin measurement. Okay. So, a 28-year-old woman with irregular menstrual cycles, hirsutism, and difficulty conceiving is diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome. Elevated prolactin levels are found during investigation. What is the most likely cause of the elevated prolactin levels in this case? So PCOS women, they will have elevated prolactin levels. And what is the likely cause of this? It is disrupted hypothalamic dopamine secretion. So dopamine is basically prolactin inhibitory substance. So if the dopamine levels they are reduced, prolactin levels they increase, or if there is reduced sensitivity to dopamine, then also the prolactin levels they increase. Or if there are also in these cases some prolactin release factors, the PRFs which are present, which also result in increased prolactin secretion.